Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn to the very first poem of the 43 poems of Drum Taps, first songs for a prelude, which is kind of an interesting title and first line of this poem. Now we're going to have more to say about why the poems are arranged in the order in which they're arranged. Note the irony of Drum Taps itself. Taps, of course, that bugle playing that will be a part of death and will happen, first played officially at the end of the Civil War itself. You'll remember that in To Thee, O Cause, that Whitman had said, "My book and the war are one." We're going to kind of pay attention to the ways in which that idea gets played out so powerfully. Now, our assumptions are that you've been with us at LearnStrong.net. Down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt is our playlist from the inscriptions passage I just mentioned, To Thee, O Cause, all the way up to and including an introductory set of comments on drum taps. And my hope is that you have already been able to follow that. Now, our Nortons will tell us that this poem, in 1865 and in 67, this introductory poem was simply entitled Drum Taps. In 1871-76, it was preceded by 4 lines in italics, which served as an epigraph for the whole group. And that reads as, "Aroused and angry, I thought to beat the alarm and urge relentless war. But soon my fingers failed me, my face drooped, and I resigned myself to sit by the wounded and soothe them, or silently watch the dead." End quote. In 1881, the poem took its first line for its title, and the epigraph became the 4th, 5th, and 6th lines of The Wound Dresser. Now, I'm hopeful that you will remember this set of lines from Song of Joys, which I think powerfully sets up our reading of the Drum Taps poems, and especially O Songs. Do you remember this set of lines? "Oh, to resume the joys of the soldier, to feel the presence of a brave commanding officer, to feel his sympathy, to behold his calmness, to be warmed in the rays of his smile, to go to battle, to hear the bugles play and the drums beat, to hear the clash of artillery, to see the glittering of the bayonets and musket barrels in the sun, to see men fall and die and not complain, to taste the savage taste of blood, to be so devilish, to gloat so over the wounds and deaths of the enemy." I said when we met that set of lines how ironic it was that it was in a collection called Song of Joys, right? The scholars who have studied closely Drum Taps has pointed out that Whitman does a remarkable job of laying out his poems, beginning with those first 8 or 9 poems to demonstrate the level of exuberance and joy, dare we say it, joy, expectation at the beginning of the war. And then later on, as I said to you in our introductory set of comments, by the time we hit poem 21 in A Wound Dresser, we already are seeing that Whitman is going to change his view about so much of the lines that we just read from Song of Joys. Let's go ahead now and let's turn to this poem. I wish I had time to just read it in its entirety to you. I don't, so we'll just go right away. By the way, remember that Prelude is used just one more time in Ages and Ages Returning. He begins by saying, "First, O songs for a prelude." And again, the word "O" is going to get used here 5 times in order and then 7 times total in this poem. Again, we're back to singing and we're back to songs. Now, this is going to be a song about war. And I believe, standing behind this poem, is going to be Virgil's Aeneid, especially those opening lines of "Arms and the Man I Sing." I've given full lectures on that poem elsewhere at LearnStrong.net. "Lightly strike on the stretched tympanum," drum, "pride and joy in my city." You'll remember in starting from Pomenock number 1, this idea of how Manhattan was Whitman's city. And then he's going to personify the city in the feminine. "How she led the rest to arms," again, of "Arms and the Man I Sing," the Aeneid. "How she gave the cue. How at once with lithe limbs, unwaiting a moment, she sprang." The idea being the excitement of going to war. Now, of course, we know from our history of the American Civil War any number of scholars have pointed out, there really were people living in the North, in New York and elsewhere, D.C., who actually believed that this war would last only a matter of days. Then it was, well, it can't be longer than 3 months. This thing will all be over. Of course, the horror of all horror is how long it did last. But notice, here at the very beginning, everyone's excited. And then in parenthetics, oh, superb, oh, Manhattan, my own, my peerless. And then we're going to start to see these exclamation points. There will be 15 of them in this poem. Oh, strongest you in the hour of danger and crisis. Oh, truer than steel. Irony, of course, that so much of the war was really, it hinged on the use of steel, didn't it? How you sprang, notice we're back to the verb sprang again. How you sprang, how you threw off the costumes of peace with indifferent hand. It's hard to know if Whitman is speaking ironic in so many of the Drum Taps poems. Clearly, this can be read ironically. They were just so quickly ready to get rid of the idea of peace with an indifferent hand. How your soft opera music changed. We've commented on Whitman's love of music and opera. And the drum and fife were heard in their stead. Of course, the drum and fife, and this is the only time in Leaves of Grass that phrase gets used, but it's one that he borrowed from Shakespeare, especially. We think about Much Ado. Were heard in their stead. How you led to the war, that shall serve for our prelude, songs of soldiers. How Manhattan drum taps led. And of course, drum taps will get used now one more time in this poem. 40 years had I in my city. Whitman is 41 at the beginning of the war. 40 years had I in my city seen soldiers parading. We're going to get to this idea of parading. 40 years as a pageant, till unawares the lady of this teeming and turbulent city, sleepless amid her ships, her houses, her incalculable wealth, with her million children around her, suddenly, at dead of night, at news from the south, incensed, struck with clenched hand the pavement. Now, this is an interesting line. Notice, the city is perceived as being a mother. Notice, we got all these people sleeping, kind of stumbling through history, we might say. And then all of a sudden, an awakening will happen. Incensed, struck with clenched hand the pavement. And then a two-line stanza, a shock electric. And of course, to hear the word electric makes us think of I sing the body electric. A shock electric, the night sustained it, till with ominous hum our hive at daybreak poured out its myriads. And the idea of bees coming out of a hive is compelling. Then two more lines again as a stanza. From the houses then, and the workshops, and through all the doorways, leapt they tumultuous, and lo, Manhattan, army. This use of the word leapt, in other words, what Whitman is wanting to emphasize is that at the beginning of the Civil War, there was almost like exuberance about, let's go, let's go, let's go. And then, one more time, to the drum taps prompt, the young men falling in and arming, and now sounding very much like earlier lines in Leaves of Grass, where he's going to list this cataloging that we've seen with the repetition of the word the. The mechanics arming, the trowel, the jack plane, the blacksmith's hammer tossed aside with precipitation, right? This idea, notice you were working and then all of a sudden we're off to go to war. The lawyer leaving his office. Now, of course, the repetition of the word leaving here makes us think that the title of all these poems is Leaves of Grass. I think, again, it's compelling. These are some of the more compelling poems in all of Leaves of Grass, just for word choice alone. The lawyer leaving his office and arming, the judge leaving the court, the driver deserting his wagon in the street. We know about Whitman and his love of the drivers. Jumping down, throwing the reins abruptly down on the horse's back. It's almost as if the eye of Whitman is becoming more focused. The salesman leaving the store, the boss, bookkeeper, porter, all leaving. Squads gather everywhere by common consent and arm. Of course, this common consent takes us to the whole quest for unity. And then notice the brilliant eye that Whitman has here. The new recruits, even boys. The old men show them how to wear their accoutrements. They buckle the straps carefully. Outdoors arming, indoors arming, the flash of the musket barrels, the white tents cluster in camps, the armed sentries around, the sunrise cannon, and again at sunset. Armed regiments arrive every day, pass through the city, and embark from the wharves. And then in parentheses, how good they look as they tramp down to the river. Now, of course, this word tramp gets used in Song of Myself, passage 46. I tramp a perpetual journey, come listen all. Only now, the tramping obviously is to go off to war. Later in drum taps to go off to their slaughter often. Tramp down to the river, sweaty with their guns on their shoulders, and he says how good all of that looks, and we're back to more exclamation points. How I love them. Now, there will be great debate about Whitman's involvement with these young men soldiers that he will nurse during the Civil War. Here he will say, how I love them, how I could hug them with their brown faces and their clothes and knapsacks covered with dust. The blood of the city up-armed, armed, the cry everywhere. The flags flung out from the steeples of churches and from all the public buildings and stores, that is to say, complete unity, even, notice, war and religion brought together. The tearful parting, the mother kisses her son, the son kisses his mother. Loath is the mother to part, yet not a word does she speak to detain him. Of course, we're reminded that Spartan mothers could only say to their sons, return with your shield or on it. They were not supposed to show grieving, and here we'll see the same. By the way, this word loath gets used a few more times in Leaves of Grass. We're going to pick it up with Sleepers, passage 6. The mother was loath, and we'll come back to this set of lines. The tumultuous escort, notice that word tumultuous keeps coming. The tumultuous escort, the ranks of policemen preceding, clearing the way. The unpent enthusiasm, you'll remember this word unpent from Broadway pageant. The unpent enthusiasm, and I think this is the heart of what Whitman is getting at in these opening poems of Drum Taps. The wild cheers of the crowd for their favorites, the artillery, the silent cannons bright as gold, drawn along, rumble lightly over the stones. Silent cannons soon to cease your silence, soon unlimbered to begin the red business. Now, that red business, only time it ever gets used in Leaves of Grass is right here. And there have been a number of readers that have pointed out the irony of the silent cannons, the gold being mentioned, and the business being mentioned. That in fact, standing behind so much of this great contest was economic motives that were sometimes less than pure. By the way, the unlimbered here will only get used in this poem the 2 times. This is the first of those. It's like an untying, an unlimbering, right, to get ready. And then all the mutter of preparation. Mutter, what an interesting word. All the mutter of preparation, all the determined arming. The hospital service, 8 times the word hospital gets used in Drum Taps. And of course, we said in our earlier lecture of introduction that the hospital is in many ways really the metaphor, central metaphor for Whitman of the war. The hospital service, the lent, bandages, and medicines. The women volunteering for nurses, the work begun for in earnest, no mere parade. Now, notice we were back to 40 years had I in my city seen soldiers parading. In other words, we're not just showing off anymore. It's not about parading now. And then the use of the word war, exclamation point. An armed race is advancing, exclamation point. The welcome for battle, no turning away. And again, so much of the lines in Drum Taps can be read as legitimate or as ironic, depending. That is to say, were we blind, completely oblivious to what was about to happen, Whitman could be asking. And then he uses the word war again. War, be it weeks, months, or years, and of course, let's say what it is out loud, from the 12th of April of 1861 to the 9th of April, 1865, right? So obviously it wasn't weeks or months at all. An armed race is advancing to welcome it. And any number of individuals who have read this line about armed race have recognized the power of the pre-20th century notion of the armed race and the way in which it's a race. And then he goes Manhattan, from Manhattan to Manhattan, a march, and it's oh to sing it well. It's oh for a manly life in the camp. So now we're obviously celebrating this whole notion of the masculinity of the project. And the sturdy artillery, the guns bright as gold, don't miss it, that it gets used a second time. The work for giants. And of course, it's interesting that he would use a mythic idea like this, giants. To serve well the guns. Unlimber them, second use of the word. Unlimber them, no more as the past 40 years for salutes, for courtesies merely. Put in something now besides powder and wadding. there's some dark irony in these lines. In other words, we can parade these military technologies, and they're not that big of a deal because we fail to remember that they are designed for one purpose only, and that is the destruction of human life. And you, lady of ships, you, Manhattan, I think, as I've said, T.S. Eliot very much influenced by some of the lines in Leaves of Grass. You'll remember in Dry Salvages 4, lady whose shrine stands on the promontory, pray for all those in ships. I think here that same language. And you, lady of ships, you, Manhattan, old matron of this proud, friendly, turbulent city. Notice he keeps coming back to this notion of turbulence. Often in peace and wealth, you were pensive or covertly frowned amid all your children, but now you smile with joy, exulting old Manhattan. And even though I haven't pointed out all of the echoes, the idea of the joy, and the idea of a mother being proud of her children, all of these are powerful motifs from our earlier reading of Leaves of Grass. Well, what do we want to make of this at 2a? I think one of the major themes is that because humans have this tendency to forget, war can be something often introduced with excitement, almost a giddiness, because we do have this tendency to forget. And I think drum taps, as I said in my earlier intro lecture, drum taps is a powerful propedeutic against the idea, yay, let's all go to war, that'll be awesome. Let's find out what all this technology can actually do once we actually use it, as opposed to parading with it. At 2b, notice the 7 O's and the 15 exclamation marks. At 3a, I've mentioned Virgil's Aeneid, of Arms and the Man I Sing. And think about George Bernard Shaw's classic in 1894, Arms and the Man. I also want to mention here that Herman Melville's Battle Pieces and Aspects of the War from 1866 is a great counterpart read to Drum Taps. Finally, at 3b, what is a time in your life when you or people around you seemed almost giddy about the idea of war and how you studied that? And the obvious question is, why do we forget so quickly? That is to say, the only sin is to forget. And I think that's an argument in the Succinct Theodicy of Whitman, which is tragic and yet horrifyingly true. Thank you.